It's just a limited
Like how many exactly?
secret.
You don't need to ask any questions if you want to get some stickers, because they're lying on there.
Take the stickers.
Okay, so we're officially live, and I'm just going to make sure that we have a clicker that works. Yeah.
Good.
Good.
Great. Thank you, Jessica, broadcasting expert. Deluxe. Welcome to the meetup, and I will be talking about Kubernetes and kops. And I want just to get a feeling from all of you, who has played with Kubernetes? Who is running Kubernetes in production? Keep the hands up. Who is running Kubernetes in production in the cloud? And who is running Kubernetes in production in the cloud in Amazon? Okay, so this will be pretty new for most of you then. Where are you? You're at Meltwater. We do media analytics and content analysis, some figures on the company. Everything is done by engineers. We are around 330, distributed around 9+ engineering offices all around the globe. Kind of a good to have in mind when then Jessica talks about how we handle the users in the cluster. And I'm part of Team Bravo, and Team Bravo is part of the enablement, engineering enablement mission. We are 7 teams that provide internal services to the other developers and make their life easier, a paved superhighway so that they can be more productive and concentrate on their stuff, on their development things, so they don't need to think about the stuff that we do. Make their life easier. So among we do Kubernetes and we do logging for them. When we do Kubernetes, this is a dashboard of our production cluster. Just to give you some figures, it's around 113 clusters, nodes, 113 nodes. It goes up and down. We have enabled the cluster autoscaler. We have 70 namespaces. We give each team their namespace, or 2 or 3. We have around 25 teams plus, something like that, in the cluster. I don't know the exact number. And you see they have deployed around 350 services and around 500 deployments. And we've been in production since pretty much 1 year now. Why I say the number of nodes is changing, and we have the cluster autoscaler. This is something from yesterday. We had an event on the workload in the cluster yesterday night, a spike there, which then created a spike in the number of nodes in the cluster. And we didn't have to do anything. We noticed this in the morning when we came to the office. And after the spike in the workload decreased, the nodes went down again, which is kind of nice, that you don't need to do anything manually.
Should have that spike been?
Yes. There's some reason, some team doing something, so it looks okay. Nice. So how do we do Kubernetes? We use kops to provision the cluster in Amazon, and kops talks to Amazon to create the infrastructure, the servers, the nodes, the instances. It configures load balancers, the basic ones. It configures subnets. It configures security groups. It then deploys Kubernetes and configures Kubernetes, the masters, etcd, the nodes. Kops then also configures 2 components in Kubernetes. It's the DNS server inside Kubernetes and the network plugin. We use the Amazon VPC CNI network plugin, not Weave, not Flannel, not Calico. That's the Amazon native one. And to use kops, you write YAML. Like you write the YAML for your deployment, like you write YAML for your service, you write a YAML for your cluster, where you describe the cluster, how it should look like. A part of that, we then manually, outside of kops, add a lot of services onto the cluster to make it more interesting for our customers. we add external DNS so that they can configure DNS names from inside the YAML that they deploy. We deploy the DEX that Jessica will talk about. We have the ingress controller. We have the cluster autoscaler. These projects don't have any nice icons, unfortunately. We deploy Prometheus, Grafana, and then take care of also the logging infrastructure with the Elastic Stack. Kops is a very opinionated tool. It does things in a certain way that, you can agree with or you don't agree with. You don't need to agree with everything. And when you live with kops, you come up with certain lessons that I will now tell you. This list of lessons is opinionated in my way. I checked it with the rest of the team, but perhaps they would have chosen other 10 points. So this is my top 10 list. There's perhaps top 20, top 30 lists to talk about, but top 10 list. The first one, immutable infrastructure. Kops deploys a server, configures the components on the servers, Kube API server, the Kubelet, the controller and scheduler, and leaves it like that. Whenever you want to change that configuration, what it does, it will drain the node, terminate that node, and redeploy that server with a new configuration, which is kind of good because you know what's deployed, which is kind of annoying that you want to change some small configuration flag in one Kubernetes component, and you will need to redeploy all your 114 nodes instead of just deploying the configuration and restarting the services. The next point, the feature flags. I said that when Kubernetes is configured with these feature flags and configuration options, and not all of those are supported by kops. So if you're missing that option, you either accept it or you need to modify the source code to add that configuration option into kops.
Could you give us an example of like a feature flag that you would?
How many times you have required to change?
We needed to change this perhaps 3-4 times during the last year.
Okay.
And in the beginning we had problems because we ran into other bugs. Simona, you know one of the feature flags that it does not support by heart.
Probably.
There are so many that I also don't. The same goes to these components. I said that it deploys for you the DNS service, it deploys for you the CNI plugin, and these are services running inside Kubernetes which are deployed with a YAML. That YAML is hard-coded into the kops binary with very limited possibilities to change it.
Okay.
So if you have a new version, say for kubedns or for your network plugin, you cannot change it. You have to live with the version that kops supports. Or you change the source code, you add the new flag, you add the additional configuration options, and we have those, for example, on the network plugin. We want to configure the network plugin in a way that kops does not do. And to do that, we had to add this into the source code of kops and then compile our own version. The next thing, everything is in one bucket. etcd is part of the Kubernetes masters, of the Kubernetes master service, which means you don't have a separate etcd cluster. It could be fine. It can cause problems. etcd requiring resources and stealing them from the Kubernetes components. Further on, I said that kops does a rolling update of the nodes. It destroys a node and adds a new node. etcd is a database. You might want to leave that one untouched when you don't do a change to it. So each time we do a change to the masters or update the masters, etcd, one of the etcd nodes is also destroyed, which is kind of stupid if you don't need to do any changes to the your database, the brain of and memory of Kubernetes. Next point, the kops release cycles. Kops development is rather slow. It takes a while until a new version comes out that supports a new version of Kubernetes. 1.12 is now in beta for kops.
Okay.
Kubernetes is in 1.14,
Yeah.
and 1.15 development has started last week and will be out in 10 weeks. So it lags a little bit behind. I mean, it's not a problem. You don't need to be on the latest and greatest and fancy and living on the edge version, but it would be kind of nice to be closer to reality and the outside world.
What does AWS currently support?
1.11,
1.11. Yeah.
yes.
12, I think. It is.
They're moving
They
to
just
1.12, but it's and AWS EKS. They in the beginning they didn't support updates at all.
Okay.
You had a 1.10 cluster and you were stuck with it. You couldn't upgrade from 1.10 until they did some magic. But here at least it comes, but it comes slowly, and it's sometimes it's frustrating. In particular, if you have bugs or you have security vulnerabilities that you want to fix. So the beginning was setup of the cluster, how you configure it. Now a few topics come on running the cluster with kops. One of those is security groups. Security groups are like firewall rules. When you deploy a service of type load balancer in Kubernetes, a AWS load balancer is created, and that one gets a firewall rule, so to say, a security group rule to allow traffic from that AWS load balancer to the Kubernetes nodes. That load balancer is added as one rule to the security groups for all the Kubernetes nodes, which means that for every load balancer, one of these rules is created. And there is a limit on this. You can only have 50 rules. One security group can only have 50 rules, which in the end means 50 load balancers. You want to have more than 50 load balancers in your Kubernetes cluster if you have a lot of users. We found this limit and the workaround in the source code of the AWS Cloud Controller on how to reconfigure Kubernetes to work around this limit. The first fix was to deploy ingress. The second fix was to get this removed, but we needed to look into the source code for that and found a solution. Next one. This was a big topic last year. The kubelet talks to the Kubernetes API master, keeps a connection open, but does not have a heartbeat to the API master. The API master goes down, the kubelet keeps the connection open until the operating system default in TCP connection closed the connection after 15 minutes, which meant that your nodes were not ready for 15 minutes. If you use a load balancer from your nodes to the masters, you might not notice this error because the load balancer will close the connection for you earlier. If you run kops, the nodes talk with DNS round robin directly to the service. And if the server disappears, the kubelet tries to keep the connection open for 15 minutes until Linux closes it. If you do a rolling update of your master nodes, you see the problem? You have a cluster that will become not ready, which is not good. We found a workaround. Simone found a good workaround for that, on how to deal with this. So we can do rolling updates without being affected by this. Before the bug was fixed. Now this bug is fixed. They added a heartbeat. Next topic. A bug in the network plugin. which caused network interfaces. ENI is elastic network interfaces. It's virtual network interfaces that are attached to your nodes, to your service. The service can have more than one ENI normally. The network plugin requests another network interface, attaches IP addresses to it, and gives them to Kubernetes. In this case, the network plugin requested a new network interface for the server. The server already had the maximum of network interfaces that it can support, and then the network plugin kept the network interface around and requested another one and requested another one. And at the end, we had 3,000 of these network interfaces dangling in the in our Amazon VPC, and we had to delete those because it caused a lot of problems, and we had to upgrade the CNI plugin. Deleting network interfaces is not that easy if you have a lot of those. You run into API rate limit request, and a colleague of us that is not here had to do a lot of manual operations to work around this. But it was interesting. 3,000 network interfaces. Wow. Another CNI bug, another bug in the network plugin. The service can have more than one network interface, and they distribute these IP addresses from all the network interfaces to Kubernetes. Then a pod, Kubernetes then takes one of these IP addresses and gives it to the pod. When a pod gets an IP address from a non-primary network interface, it cannot have any cluster internal communication. It can talk to the outside world, but it cannot talk to another pod in the cluster. We found this by random errors in the beginning until we looked into that. The funny thing is, this bug only appears for certain servers that you request from Amazon, from the certain instance families, not for the primary instance group family that we normally request. But we want to use more server types, and there we ran into this problem. It's supposed to be fixed in the next version. At least it seems to be fixed. And last but not least, there are hooks in kops. Hooks are scripts that kops puts on the server and is run when the server is starting up, when systemd is starting up. And you can use these hooks to do certain stuff. And actually this is a good thing of kops, because with these hooks we can run some scripts that can fix vulnerabilities. We fixed the runc vulnerability with that, because kops is so slow that it could not fix the vulnerability in time, but with the hook we were able to deploy the fix via the script. So that's actually a nice thing to have. So now you wonder why we use kops. And before that, we fixed a lot of these things by reading the source code. We spend a lot of time reading the source code to find the fixes or understand what's going on. And without that, we would not be able to run this in a good way. And we could switch to EKS in Amazon, their Kubernetes thing. But if you see this list, this is a list of a company that made a blog post on what they needed to do to production-proof EKS, the Amazon Kubernetes service. It's also 20 points, like we have 20 points. So you're exchanging one set of problems and get another set of problems. And then you would think of, okay, let's switch to a fully managed service, like the Google Kubernetes engine. Yeah, but it seems that now you even don't run simple Kubernetes there as well. There is this repository on GitHub It contains 26 right now, no, 24 public postmortems, and a couple of them go also to the fully managed Google Kubernetes engine. Supposed to be fully managed, but you also run into problems there. Very interesting reads. Can recommend it. And that is the top 10 list that I had on running kops in Amazon
So you must
to
be
deploy
the
Kubernetes.
contributor now to kops.
Sorry?
You must be the contributor back to the codes.
We have contributed back with PRs regarding documentation
Okay.
a couple of times. Also code. We added the CNI plugin, but then a lot of documentation. Whenever we found something in the code, we updated the documentation to reflect that, so that the next person will find it easier. It's kind of like a love and hate relationship, kind of. Sometimes you will just kick it out the window. The next time it's, oh, nice. You run kops, it manages your infrastructure as well, your service and everything. You don't need to take care of this.
Why kops instead of Ansible? Just because
We were not using Ansible, we were using Terraform and then Puppet for some other infrastructure. Getting away from Puppet is quite nice. Not having to depend on some other configuration service is quite nice. There you have everything packed inside the kops way of doing things. It's one opinionated way of doing things. It could take care of the Amazon infrastructure for us. It supported the Amazon network plugin, which is quite nice since we want to do native VPC peering to other accounts and other subnets. So yes, KubeSpray does not support this Amazon CNI plugin.
If I can add, so
Yeah.
I mean we've been running production for over a year,
Yeah,
and when we started out, then kops was the best choice.
yes,
It might not be that anymore, but at that time it was
it
the best
was.
choice.
And EKS was not even available during that time in Amazon either. It came during the fall, like 6 months after we went
Like
into
August
production.
or something.
Yes, and that not even in Ireland, only in the US.
Yeah.
Ireland was added later on. So for us it was, do we want to get Kubernetes ready for production or not? Here is the top 10 list again, and the pictures I found on Unsplash. And if you have any question, just reach out, ask me on the details further on. You could certainly talk 1 hour per detail without any problem. And with that, I hand over to Jessica.
Thank you. So feel free to grab something more to drink or some more snacks and stuff while I set up my presentation, and we'll kick off at 7.
To Federico,
Yes.
what is the best thing with kops?
what you love about the
It's a single binary. You can write the YAML for your cluster configuration, and you can just run it from your laptop.
That is awesome. Thank you so much.
so you can update the code on your side, move it around, but Ansible be open source. No, it's fine.
lampar med både egen kluster och bare metal. How do you share this? What is the
We have one repo where we just configure the basic VPC and nothing else. Yes. No,
Det beror ju på tjänsterna på vilket sätt de kan prata våra tjänster med meddelande kön. Kör mellan.
And you grab the external services also from Terraform. Didn't you mention like
Testa båda spåren. Vi skulle ju vilja köra det. Det kan vara lite utmaningar och se saker som inte känns så kommer lagen in.
Can we get her up, please?
So they can control the load itself. Yes or
No pressure, no pressure. Yeah. Okay, so my name is Jessica. I work here at Meltwater. I'm part of the same team as Federico is, and we're working with the Kubernetes as a service for our other engineering team. And as Federico mentioned, we are about 50 teams working in engineering in Meltwater. And we're distributed over multiple different offices, but not only offices, but also countries and time zones and cultures. So we are very widespread. We span most of the time zones in the world. And I'm going to talk to you about how we manage our users in a multi-tenant Kubernetes cluster, because we have one cluster, the one and only cluster. We don't have a dev cluster. Okay, we have, but not for users. Because we actually do test before we go to production. I know it sounds weird. But we have one single cluster for our users, and they run their development and staging in production or test or whatever they might call their environments. They run it in the same cluster. So that means that we have to do a few things in order to make it safe for the users, but also because they also don't want to impact each other's, right? They don't want a different team being able to suddenly kill off their pod, because then they get sad, especially when they get paged and woken up. So I'm going to talk mainly about two things. I'm going to talk about authorization and authentication. Authorization is how we say what they are allowed to do, and authentication is how we know they are them when they access the cluster. I'm going to start with authorization. If I misspelled it anywhere, please ignore it. Yes, please ignore it. So I'm going to talk about role-based access control. And what this means is that we're putting up roles for everything that they can do, and then we assign those roles to users. And it's a concept that is introduced in Kubernetes. Other tools also use it. And you can run Kubernetes without rbac, but I think it's de facto standard of how you manage users currently. This is typical how a role could look that we actually have. I just copy-pasted and then I deleted some things in the end because this file goes on for many hundred lines. And the reason for that is because you define everything, every resource that you want your users to have access to, and then you define each verb that the users can use on it. And you know that you have get, you have list, you have watch, you create, you have delete grouping or collection, and then you have a lot of different things. I don't remember every verb. I Google it every time because it's impossible to remember. And you don't only have pods, you have deployments, you set for sets, daemon sets, etc., etc., etc. Wonder which my next slide is. Yeah, next slide is good. So here's a few things, and it's additive. That means that you need to add for everything that you want them to have access to. You can think of it as a whitelist rather than a blacklist, if that makes it easier for you. Gets very verbose, and as I said, the files get very long, which means that if you make a few changes, that could be quite a lot of code to review, and it might be hard to know that you get what you want. Next slide. Right. What I showed you was an example. It's called cluster role, and we have cluster roles versus roles. And basically what that means is cluster roles are on a cluster scope. That means that everything that exists in the cluster, Kubernetes cluster, while a role is namespace scope. That means everything that exists within a specific namespace. So thinking back to the users, they have their production, the staging, their development. That means that they have each a specific namespace for this like team-production, team-development. So that means that the role that they get assigned is just within their development namespace or within a production namespace. except that the resource itself is within the namespace. It's created at namespace level, which means that, checking what I had. Yeah, so we have, you get a role binding, across a role binding and a role binding. This is what you have to bind it to subjects being users or service accounts or whatever you have. That means that the cluster role binding goes to the cluster role and the role binding to the role. That means that for each namespace we need to have a role that gives the users access to deploy list pods, etc., etc. That means that we have basically somewhere around 70 roles just to manage, which is a lot of resources. Makes it hard to keep track. That is also basically 70 files then in Git that we need to keep track of and update every time we want to give the teams access to some new feature, which is additive, as I mentioned. Until lesson learned. You can have a role binding to a cluster role, which means that you can have one master cluster role that says you get access to get pods, list pods, deployments, etc., etc., etc. But when you create a role binding, it ends up in a namespace scope, which means that you don't get access to all namespaces for this, only the namespace that the role binding is created within. I'm letting it sink in. I will repeat. What it means is, within each namespace, each team has a role binding that says you can list pods, deployments, create secrets, etc., etc. within this namespace. You cannot do it in team B's namespace, but you can do it in team A's namespace, which means that you will not be able to fuck up someone else's environment. It's good, everyone happy. We are very happy because we only have this one to manage and not like 70 of these, which makes us happy. It took a while before we realized this, and then we could delete so many lines of code, and I was very happy. It was a good day. Right, lessons learned. One cluster role, many role bindings. Happy, happy. Did I have more on this one? No, just another click. Admin role versus user roles. When you manage Kubernetes, you have the super admin role, as I usually call it. I don't know what it's called, to be honest, but it gives you access to everything, everywhere, all the time. Which means that when you test new functionality, everything works all the time, because you have access to everything. And then you tell your users, like, I have a great idea. Let's try this one. You can try, for instance, you can run top on a pod, and you can see like htop or top. You can see the processes that are running, like how much memory, how much CPU are they taking. It's a great tool for debugging. You just use it, and the users go like, this is awesome, it will help me so much. Except I get permission denied. And you're like, did I really test this as a user? Which we of course didn't, and we have done this also multiple times, and so we should have learned by now. But in the end, test the user experience before you release it, and use the same role access as users have when you do it. Otherwise they get sad. Sorry about the flashing images. kubectx and kubeNS is a nice tool when you're working command line with Kubernetes. What it allows you to do is to switch between contexts. So let's say you have like maybe production, staging, development. You maybe have multiple clusters as we do. We have the dev clusters. We have one production cluster, and it's very nice to be able to just say kubectx, go to the cluster I want to have. You can do this with kubeconfig, select, etc., etc., except it's like 5 items long command. I never remember. This one is so much easier. kubeNS lets you do basically the same thing, except that you do it between namespaces. You're a developer, you have your production, staging, and development namespace, and you can use kubeNS in order to switch between those. And you can also, I think at one point, get like a list of the namespaces. Awesome tool. We think like this is perfect. It will help you so much. Combine it with something that like types out on your prompt, like where you are as well, and it will be awesome. Users, go ahead and use this. It will make your day so much easier. You'll go like, great, I will try that. Except I cannot list namespaces because it's a cluster scope resource. So I don't have access to it because you only gave me access to the namespace resources. Sad. Should we have tested this? Yes, we probably should. Did we? No. Again. So, we actually created a cluster role, which is the cluster scope level. We call it Kubernetes. It gives you resource namespaces, get list watch. Nothing bad can happen from this. You can only get list watch. Super good. And then we actually bind it. This is how role binding looks. Here's subject. It's who can use this. It's role ref, the cluster role, Kubernetes. Slide before, cluster role, Kubernetes. Yes. So what this says is we don't care who you are as long as you're authenticated towards the system. As long as you're authenticated, you can list namespaces. That's all we care about. Yes.
Will this enable you to see all the namespaces in the dashboard as well?
We have a different thing for that, but in theory, yes.
Oh, thank you for that.
We actually have a specific similar setup for the dashboard view to allow teams to use the Kubernetes dashboard and view other resources. But this one was so short, so it was easier to put into the slides. So there's a few things that we learned and that could be useful for you if you're managing user authorization. Any questions on this part before I move on? Because it will be slightly different. No?
You get swag for questions.
Also feel free to just, yeah.
There were several slides before. I forgot that there was no page number. Yeah, that one. That you said is at the same time you're likely to fuck about it. Team.
You only get
information, and then at the same time it's nice to have the one admin role to control everything.
Yes.
Which one is your?
We have the super admin role.
Yeah.
The teams, the users of the cluster, they get that role binding that is only valid within their namespace. Or actually their free namespaces, in case they have free namespaces, of course.
That makes everything easier for me. I mean, I assume.
Yeah.
Yeah.
T-shirt.
But we also,
why?
because you ask questions. T-shirt for questions. Yeah, yeah.
The thing is that you seem not very happy because for me, I usually people think of as admin is kind of good to easy to control and so on, but you seem not very happy.
Which
in that
part am I not happy about? This one. Oh, I'm super happy about this one. I was just annoyed that it took so long before we found it.
Okay.
Yeah.
One of the
After that,
yeah.
this one is the line that I'm happy about. This one was the one that I was more sad about.
Okay.
But otherwise, I'm happy.
For me, it's kind of like a.
Okay.
But
Dashed line is good line. Okay. Dashed line is good line. Cool. Yes.
Delegate.
And to add to this, you also have a few predefined cluster roles that you actually can use, so you don't have to add them yourself.
Yeah.
Like view, edit.
Exactly. There is something that is already available that you can use. Cool. So we move on to the authentication part. Authentication. How do I know that you as a user have actually access to the API? And once you have access, then we apply whatever we already looked at, right? So we started out with creating client certificates, and what this means is that we used OpenSSL, SSL. I think this is what we used. We removed the code because we don't use it anymore, so I didn't want to go digging in history. But basically what we did was that we created certificate files for each user that was going to access the cluster. In those files, we also defined what groups they would have access to. For instance, this would be like a team name or like something like that. And if someone switched team, or like they were going to share on calls, so they wanted to have access to each other's namespaces, we would need to update. We would need to create new certificates for them. And also, I don't know why we ended up with 3 different files, but it was 3 different files, and we would need to share all 3 of those in a secret way. So that was also a hassle to just distribute the files to the users. And it was fine when we had onboarded one team. We were working with one team that was the only ones that were using the cluster. We onboarded the second team. It was still okay, but we started looking at this is not going to scale. We're looking into how we could automate it, and in the end we was like, fuck no, this is not working. Sorry for swearing. Definitely did not. That was the feeling we had, at least. So we looked into.
I was thinking that as you are giving the certificate for each user and assigning the group, can it would be possible that one user is working on the multiple teams?
Yeah.
So they have the multiple group number inside.
Yeah, this could be like instead of app, because we don't have the app separation, it could be team A, team B, team C.
Yeah.
So that could be totally. But if someone was first working for team A and team B, and then suddenly was going to handle also team C,
Yeah.
then we would need to create a new certificate for managing
or
that.
getting robbed from team B, then
Yeah, exactly. So that means that every time they changed which teams they would have access to or which namespaces they would have access to, we needed to create a new certificate. I cannot say that happened that often, but it has happened when we moved to new situations, so I'm very happy we were not in this situation when that was going on. So we went over into Open ID Connect tokens. There's many different providers that provide this solution. This is pulled from Kubernetes official documentation, so feel free. I think I will share my slides, and if in that case you find the links in the presenter speaker notes. That means that what you do is that when you authenticate through one of these, you get an access token, an ID token, and refresh token. And you put this into your, either you apply them on command line through kubectl -- token. Every time you run a kubectl command, you can see how this is not going to work out, yeah? Or you put it into your configuration. And then you don't have to apply it, supply it every time you run kubectl. So this is what we decided on. And we actually decided to use DEX in combination with GitHub. What DEX is that it sets up a client for you so that you can authenticate through GitHub and get the tokens back in a good way. And then that it communicates to Kubernetes and like keeps the refresh token refreshed and stuff like that. I would love to talk more about DEX, but honestly I don't know that much about it because once it works I don't want to touch it more. That's just me. I'm sorry about that, but that's true.
Does that mean that all your employees have a GitHub account or something?
Yes. This is why we chose this solution.
we also manage the Git accounts in Git.
If you don't talk that much, my slides will explain everything. I will get further to that in a few slides in. But yes, this is the reason why we picked this solution is because we already have everything set up with GitHub. It's we keep all our code in GitHub, and we have a GitHub organization for the company. And it's a clear part of the onboarding and offboarding process that people get added to GitHub and get removed from GitHub. So that's something that we don't have to manage at all. We offload a lot of the user management by using GitHub, which is a very nice solution for us.
I was wondering how it works. Let's suppose I'm working on team A. I have the privilege of team A, and then I move to team B. Then how your this GitHub solution will help us to get the authorization?
And I will show that in a bit. I have no idea where this line should come in this order, but it's probably a good idea. So this is an example of how we set up namespaces. And as you can see, this is my team. This is our demo namespace. It's where when we do workshop with other teams and etc., we like to have a nice clean slate where we can work. And that's going to be our demo namespace. And it's just basically the name of it, and then we add some labels because. And this is how role binding can look for this. So the role binding will give us, it has some name, it goes together with the deployment manager cluster role that we have that give the users access in the namespace resources with the role binding to a cluster role, right? And the subject is like a list of users. This is how we started out because this was the only way it worked with DEX to begin with. That meant that we needed the name, the email address of each user because that's what we got back from GitHub. And then there's some add-on, and it's like kind is just another thing. When you have like many people in a team, it gets very long as well. Yes.
So what in situation that GitHub is down?
Huh?
What in situation when GitHub is down?
Most of the time you're fine with the refresh token, but yes, if you have to sign in again, then you will not be able to sign in again. But we always have service accounts in each namespace that has the same access as you have as a user. So you can use your CI/CD solution to deploy if you need to.
And there's no limit on the number of teams in that.
Of the number of users
Yes.
in this list. Well, we actually, I don't know. Probably some limit. We never hit it.
Oh.
I don't know, to be honest. Don't try to put 100. It's probably going to break.
A little bit annoying as well, because that's the email you use on your GitHub account, which is usually not, it's your personal email, so you couldn't just fetch those from the company, right? Which was quite annoying, because you had to ask people about their GitHub emails.
And it was also even worse than that, because it was in case you had a public email address attached to a GitHub account, that one was used. Unless you did not have a public email attached to a GitHub account, then it was your primary email address that got picked. So it was, to say it was kind of messy, which brings us back to the teams. Also, you can see here how we need to do code changes every time someone joins or leaves a team, so want to be added, etc., etc. We don't want to handle that. Honestly, we don't want to.
I thought no one puts their private account because GitHub has the separate option for the corporate.
Usually they have one GitHub account, one login, and they have both email addresses in it, but maybe they don't want to have their company email as the public or the primary email, then it becomes a problem, right? Because we cannot choose which one it will pick. We cannot say always pick the company one. It depends on how each user configured their GitHub. Nightmare. This is how we set up GitHub. I like the purple smileys. I'm not sure if you like it, but I'm happy with it. So we have a lot of different repositories for our code, and we have different teams. This is GitHub teams. I couldn't find a better way to express it, but it's GitHub teams. You know, in an organization, how many uses GitHub organization? Okay, so not that many. In GitHub organizations, you can create teams in the organization, which means that you can say that we have, for instance, then Team Alpha. Team Alpha is admins of repo X and Y and Z. Team Beta is also admins of repo Z, but also O and E. I'm sorry, it's like last minute fixes, right? But this is also like you can, if you're like a GitHub admin, then you can add and remove people to the team. So we don't want to manage that, right? So the teams can manage that themselves. But if we know that Team Alpha always will have, like Team Alpha will always be like a team, then we can have people tell us that, oh right, I didn't have that slide I thought. So we can tell, people can say that Team Alpha should have access to the Alpha Dev, Alpha Staging, Alpha Prod namespace. And that is something we can manage, right? Because then we always say, like, if you're part of Team Alpha, I don't care who's in it. If you are in it, then you can have access to this. We like that. So that means that we can go from something like this. We're usually somewhere around 5 people in, we're 5 people in our team, so I put 5 people. This is quite a long list. We can go do this instead, which makes me very happy. It needs to be the name of the organization, and then it's the team within that organization. So we're at Meltwater, and we're Team Bravo. That gives us access to everything in the Bravo demo namespace, which is so much easier. We don't have to care about specific individuals. All we care about is if you have your things set up correctly with GitHub teams, which most team at our organization have due to that being a standard, it's just solved. We didn't know that we wanted this to start with. It was just not available. But once the feature was released, we started using it, and we are very happy with it. So, authorization. rbac is additive. That means that you need to add the roles for it when you add new features. You can have one cluster role with many role bindings to it, and that means that each role binding has a specific namespace that the cluster role is applied in, right? And you should test as your users will use the cluster, because otherwise you're screwed. And
how do you do this?
how we do it?
How have you done it?
We have, when we do it, we actually have the same setup as this one. We have it in place. This is when we sign in the same way as the users do. So we just have the same setup. And then we have the cluster administrative namespaces as well, which we use as the admin role, but this is something that we use as the user role.
Thanks.
And authentication, there's so many different ways to do it. The reason why we chose Dex and GitHub is because we have GitHub set up. We don't need to find something new to do it. If you're already using IAM roles, use that by all means. It's just not something that we have set up that will work. So find what fits your organization and try to work with groups rather than individuals. It will make your life so much easier. And that's it. Thank you. Any questions? No. Then we'll take another 5-minute break, and then Simon will talk. Well, I switch the slides and everything. So pick something more to drink. Maybe there's more pizza and stuff.
Pizza left, and we have drinks left.
Så jävla självmord som tar på den.
Ja, just det.
Jag har inte tänkt på det. Men varje gång du har det så har du det.
Det är varje gång.
Är det?
Jättebra. Ja.
Du borde bara använda speaking notes. Nej, setup, så du borde bara kunna börja klicka. 3, 4, mellan 1 och 4.
Ser du namnet bara?
Nej.
1000.
De ska la
Så ni var inne.
Så här.
Så ni var inne och bra lite.
Så här kan du kolla.
Ja, grymt. Så jag ser om någon skriver till vad jag är.
ये वैलिडेट करना है ये टोकन किस ग्रुप के बंदे का है मेरा मुझे एक्सेस देना है उस ग्रुप के लिए क्या ये टोकन इस ग्रुप के लिए
Inte en andra. Computing Foundations som är klara. De är lite lyft som har... Det är lyft. Lyftgrönt. De utvecklar så det är super lightweight. Så det är liksom allting så det är ju konkurrens till nej men det är en gång ingen var taggad på en liksom.
Nej men 24 där.
Jessica?
Vad gör du? Har du klickat på den andra skärmen?
Nej, jag har inte gjort någonting hittills.
Ja, men då borde du bara kunna klicka.
Ja. Men den, grymt. Ja.
Yes.
Hi everyone. Hi. My name is Simon. And I'm the next speaker at this meetup. Thank you for joining us, and I'm going to talk about something about Windows. And when I prepared for this session, I actually didn't think what language I wrote it in. So I wrote the presentation in Swedish, and so sorry for that. I will do the presentation in English, but if there's anything on there that you have a question about, just tell me.
I thought you were comfortable with English.
I am, but for some reason the PowerPoint template from the company was in Swedish and I just continued. And that's quite bad, I know. And I'm going to explain to you why. But I'm going to talk about developing on Windows. And to begin with, I will talk to you about what Xenit is. That's the company I work for, and Adam at the end of the line, and who I am, what this presentation is about, challenges in enterprise environments, and our attempt to optimize the developer loop, and at the end a conclusion. This is not about running Kubernetes on Windows, so just so I'm extremely clear about that. Xenit. We were founded 2009, and we are. I was hired at Xenit in 2009. We were me and the two owners. We are today working a lot with cloud services and security, and we have a few quite awesome reference customers. We are providing specialized consultancy services, and we are providing services to the customers as well as operations for the customers. A few of the customers, PEAB, HSB, Lindex and OF are a few of the customers we are working with. A few of the partners we are in partnership with: Microsoft, of course, Citrix, Varonis, Imprivata, Palo Alto, Nutanix. We had a few swag, so perhaps one of you got a Nutanix t-shirt. If you don't know what it is, I'm not going to explain that today. Who am I? And when it comes to the presentation later, please stop me and ask me questions. My presentations are usually written around the audience asking questions. I'm also known to take too much time, so I've asked for some help to keep the time today, so just so you know. A developer was supposed to be here with me to talk about the developer stuff. That's him. His name is Ulrich. He left me and he went to Wien and went to a conference called Reason Conf. Has anybody heard about Reason ML? No one. One person. Nice. It's it's an OCaml based language. I know Facebook is working with it a lot. He loves that stuff, and he went to a conference about it. And that's me and our children. This is me. I've been at Xenit since 2009, so that's about 10 years. In August it will be 10 years. I started Xenit when I was 19. I'm a senior consultant and nowadays a team leader for something we call Team DevOps, and we help customers to embrace the DevOps culture and help them. We try to help them to understand what DevOps is and how that can enable them to provide value to the company. I started working, within citation, with Linux around 2001. I Googled myself for that time, and I found a post from 2002 where I posted something on linux.se. So I've been working with the Linux or playing with the Linux since I was 11, if the calculations were hard, or somewhere around that. So I've been doing it a long time and I really like it. I'm also a Citrix technology professional since 2017. I'm not going to explain what that is, but I do a lot of work with the Citrix developers, and I do a lot of work within their networking and security segments. Have everyone heard about Citrix?
Yeah.
Yeah, a few of you. Alright, great. What is this presentation about? It's not about .NET, I'm sorry. I'm not a developer, and I've been working with operations for most of my life. I can read code most of the time, but it's not something I write. I help development teams to understand the operations teams better, and I help the operations teams understand the development better, because it's usually two tribes fighting each other, and when I go to the customer, I try to help them understand each other. It's not always working out that well, but I do my best. And I'm going to talk about the frustrations me and the developer at our company have had developing on Windows for applications that will be running in Kubernetes. And this is our lessons learned, and I will come to a conclusion at the end with our recommendation if anyone is considering doing this on Windows. So, the challenges in an enterprise environment. When I say an enterprise environment, I mean a Windows enterprise environment where the operations team actually don't work with Linux. They don't know anything about Linux. They only have Windows servers, Windows computers. They have an Active Directory, and that's actually most of the customers I work with. They don't have any Linux servers. So we're not using PowerPoint anymore, so my clicks are not syncing. So I'm going to do it like this instead. The operating systems in enterprise environments are usually locked down. As you can see in the top picture there, this app has been blocked by your system administrator. That's something that most developers will hit when they try to execute their own code, the compiled code, when they try to run npm build or npm install or whatever they try to do. Everything is blocked for them. Enterprise environments, most of the time, usually always have an antivirus installed, and when we work with perhaps languages like Node.js, and you have 10,000 modules and it's just so many files, it's not fast, it's quite slow. And that's why we have a snail there. Working in a lockdown environment with an antivirus, that's even worse. So you can't launch anything, and when you are able to launch it, it's slow. And in enterprise environments, you usually don't have administrative privileges. That means you can't actually install anything. So when you try to do something, you get a prompt telling you to log in or something like that, and when you log in, you don't have the permissions to do it, so you have to ask service desk or something like that. It's awful. And the last bit, VPNs, virtual private networks. You're working from home, and for some reason you need to access the network, or perhaps your employer actually forces you to connect to your VPN. You can't work with your computer, you can't access the internet without the VPN, and that's not unusual. That can cause quite a lot of problems as well, because a lot of other software that developers need you actually need network layer access, and the VPN software usually locks that down as well. So we've been hitting a lot of different issues when trying to do this, because our company, we try to be, we try to live as we teach. So we teach our customers the importance of all of these things, and then we hire developers, and the developers hate us more than anything else. So yeah, that's stuff that happens. Our attempts to optimize the developer loop. In the developer loop, in my opinion, or what I say the developer loop is from that you've updated the code until you can try it. And we try to optimize it from that you update the code until it's possible to try it. If you're working in a microservice environment where all of the other services are in Kubernetes, you usually don't want to start all of them on your computer. You want to be able to deploy this test to the development Kubernetes environment. And we we've had quite a few iterations where we've improved this. From the beginning, we committed the code and waited for our continuous integration and continuous deployment to finish, which meant we waited for somewhere around 5 minutes. That's quite fine if that's complete code, but if you have to do this 40 times because you're trying out different ways of doing it, it's awful. So we try to find new ways of doing this from Windows. So when we set it up in Kubernetes, we set it up using CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous deployment. And we do it both for the microservices as well for the infrastructure, something like kops. And it usually takes somewhere around a few minutes to build the code from when we committed it to the Git repository until it's deployed to the Kubernetes cluster. And testing and debugging in Kubernetes when you run the code over there is quite hard to do from Windows, because the utilities that are available to make this possible actually haven't been tried with Windows, and they usually just don't work. So telepresence is one of the tools that's known from most of the people who work with Kubernetes, and it works really bad with Windows. And we've also had problems where we forced everyone with a company computer to actually have a VPN set up, and it always connects. And when you have a VPN, you can't use tools that create network layer tunnels. So that's also a problem. Question?
Just what works best for the Kubernetes testing and debugging?
So there's quite a few different tools for testing and debugging the services you build. Telepresence is one of them. We actually haven't found one that we think works good in a Windows environment. And in the conclusion, I will explain more.
Why don't you use like a virtual machine?
We'll come there. In the conclusions. Stay patient, my friend. PowerShell or CMD, the shells like Bash in Windows, do not have support for command completion, like Jessica showed with kubeNS or kubectx, where you can do tab completion and get suggestions for what you should write. It's not supported in them, or at least we haven't found the support yet. You need to run Bash on your Windows computer. Script to deploy using your CI/CD, using, for example, Bash doesn't work on Windows natively, at least. And Docker is extremely slow on Windows, or that's our opinion.
Oops.
I'm thinking the new stuff, you can run Linux on Windows.
Yeah.
Like this,
VSL or WSL.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we'll get there as well.
so you haven't tried that yet?
We have.
Windows services for Linux.
Yeah. So it will actually solve a few of the problems, but some others won't be solved by it. And let's see here.
Yeah.
Docker on Windows actually uses Hyper-V, which is the hypervisor on Microsoft operating systems to virtualize. And since it's a virtual machine, it's not natively supported, and that means it will never be as fast as if it was run on a Unix system. So that's the problem. And it's not that much slower. If you only run this once a day, you wouldn't care. If you run it 100 times a day, it gets a bit annoying, because each second counts. So, yeah.
Could you use any other hypervisor like VMware or Citrix?
On Windows, this is from the Windows computer perspective. So a developer gets a computer from the company. So you could always use different hypervisors to virtualize your operating systems, but this is the experience from an end user that is given a computer with Windows on it and is trying to develop applications that are supposed to run in Kubernetes. So we will get there as well. Windows subsystem for Linux doesn't have support for Docker. You still need to install Docker on the Windows operating system and use the hypervisor. So you don't get around it. And we looked at all the different options and we just didn't feel like it worked that well. The developer at our company, Ulrich, is one of my best friends. He was quite loudly discontent about working in a lockdown Windows environment after a while. He had his hopes up for a while, but it just got worse and worse. And VPN causes issues for Docker. For example, we have a VPN product called Global Protect from Palo Alto Networks, and our developer Ulrich, he works usually from home, so he always uses the VPN when he is working, and the default setting for the VPN is to tunnel all traffic, and to tunnel all traffic causes issues for virtual machines in Hyper-V. And if it's
local network is blocked,
and if it causes issues for local machines in Hyper-V, you can't do much with Docker. So every time he connected his computer, he had to change the VPN settings.
I was thinking of something, because Docker is like, you have this Docker daemon that can run on any machine, and then Docker CLI.
Yeah.
If you perhaps run the Docker CLI on Windows and work remotely for Unix.
You can. That is possible. But then you have to connect to this machine in some way. And if it's like you want to be able to develop locally without internet access, it's kind of annoying. So we've been looking at like all the different options. So what did we do to optimize the dev loop or developer loop? Do anyone else have another name for this? Dev loop is what I call it.
Code iteration.
Yeah, code iteration. So what we actually came to a conclusion for is that it's, instead of having to work around all the issues on Windows and all the lockdown things, it's actually much easier just to set up a Linux machine on the Windows computer and connect to it. It's so much easier. But Microsoft and Ubuntu has been working together to create a much better experience to connect remotely to the virtual machine. So they have actually updated the XRDP things and stuff, and it's quite good. But you can feel that you're on a remote connection to this virtual machine, and it's still a virtual machine. It's not as fast as your local computer. I chose to run a virtual machine on my computer because I'm not a developer. I don't have to sit in it all the time, the whole day, the whole week. I perhaps use it 8 hours a week or something like that. It's fine for me to have less good user experience, but our developer Ulrich actually like 2 weeks ago, that's after half a year, he chose to go to Mac OS and run a Windows VM instead, because he's working all the time with these different utilities and he needs a first-class experience. And that's something I had a hard time understanding when we hired him, because we are so used to everyone being able to work on Windows and being able to work quite alright using the lockdowns we have, but after a while we actually came to the conclusion that we just gave his computer to someone else and bought a Mac, and
Probably
then
he was trying to get the Mac.
what did you say?
Probably he was trying to get the Mac.
Yeah, so he actually had a Mac before he started at our company, and he was quite satisfied, but he actually wanted a Windows computer because he wanted to be able to work with ReasonML in Windows, and he's one of the developers getting ReasonML to work on Windows. So he actually wanted to get it to work, but when everything took a few more minutes each time he did it, and he did it 40, 50 times a day, it got quite annoying. And that's just a few of the issues. We created scripts in the beginning using bash, and then we had so when I did the CI/CD for us, I created it in bash and started running them, and then I asked him to use these scripts when developing locally to deploy it to Kubernetes. But for some reason you don't have bash natively on Windows. You have to install VSL or use something else. So we actually started thinking about how should we develop these scripts, and we came to the conclusion that we should use PowerShell. And who else here have used PowerShell? A few of you, yeah. So the big thing is, in the beginning I worked a lot with bash and I was quite good at it, but like the last couple of, let's say 10 years since I started at Xenit, I haven't been using bash that much. I've been using PowerShell instead. And a few years ago, a year ago, Microsoft open sourced PowerShell, and they do support Mac and Linux now, and in the future this open source version will be the native version on Windows. And I know PowerShell, and other people in our team know PowerShell extremely well. So we chose to use PowerShell because we can get much more help using it. And it works on Windows, Linux and Mac, so that's extremely good. So what we did was we created a new PowerShell script that we added to each of our microservices, that we imitated the CI/CD script we wrote in bash, and we enabled Ulrich in this case to deploy all the services he was working on to Kubernetes, and it was quite fast. But the big problem was for each service we added, we got another script to write, and we had like so many different places to work on, so it got quite hard to update it. And when we had to add a variable, we had to add it to all the different scripts, and we had different variables in the pipelines and on the local builds. So we moved. Did you have a question? So we moved.
Sorry, I was drinking.
So we moved the variables from the pipelines and placed them in a JSON in the repository, and that enabled us to actually leverage the same variables for our pipelines, for our services, both locally and in the pipeline. And we've been able to get the developer build time down from somewhere around a few minutes when we committed the code to somewhere about 15 to 45 seconds if we updated dependencies, for example. Then it takes a little bit longer. And the conclusion.
You're doing well.
So if you are forced to use Windows, use a Linux VM. Docker and tools like that are much slower on Windows. Is it possible? Use Linux or Mac and use a Windows VM. If you primarily work with the tools that are slow on Windows, then that's my big recommendation. Even though it's usually quite easy to add variables to the pipeline and it's easy to manage them there, find a way where you can utilize these variables locally as well, because being able to deploy the service you're working on without committing code makes it so much cleaner and so much faster. Always seek to optimize the dev loop. Always look for things that you do or your teammates do quite a few times a day and try to optimize them. If you're able to save a minute a time, then you will save quite a lot of time each week if you do it 50 times a day.
Regarding the passwords in CI/CD as well?
Yeah. Oh, that's another question for another time, but we usually use something called HashiCorp Vault, and the secrets are stashed somewhere else. But
Throw it along to someone else.
And we are running a mono repo. I'm not sure if that's actually called that, but we are storing all our microservices or all our YAML files for our pipelines and our scripts in the same repository. And that actually made it so much easier because we're able to use the same script for all the different deployments we do. And we're able to use the same scripts locally as well as in the pipeline. And my time is up. So I'm just going to flip through a few things. To begin with, we created the variables in JSON file in the scripts. And what we did was we created variables within our variable lists. So we can actually, when we run our scripts, environment short here will be replaced by environment short there. And we're able to utilize different layers of this. It's just a regex script, like a few lines, but it's quite nice to do it that way. I'm not going to talk about the script. Questions?
I have a question related to Nutanix. Do
Yeah.
you have any experience with their Kubernetes offering?
I've heard their salespeople talk about it. It's like an overlay of the Kubernetes. They will handle things like if you're buying it from AKS, GKE or EKS. So it's an on-prem Kubernetes service. They try to make it easier for you, and they add the different Helm charts. It's the same thing if you would choose Banzai Cloud or Container Faros or something like that. They try to make everything easier for you, but I haven't used it myself. But I've heard good things about it. But we are a Nutanix partner, so I'm supposed to say that. Anyone else?
I don't know if I am right, but as far as I know, Docker is slower in Windows because it doesn't run still in native mode. It runs in emulated mode. Right?
Exactly. So that's the hypervisor. So you
That's the reason why.
yeah, the Windows machine has a hypervisor called Hyper-V, and the Docker engine runs in the virtual machine, and you connect to it through somewhere. But it's not extremely much slower, but it is slower. Yeah.
Did you try the new? It's like a preview function or preview in Docker that you can run almost like natively Linux container on Windows.
I haven't tried that myself. We are not developing applications to run natively on Windows, but I do have customers that do it. But I'm not sure about it.
But then you can run Windows container and Linux containers simultaneously.
Yeah.
The same host.
I haven't tried that.
Yeah, it works sometimes.
Yeah. And
but it might be faster when it's ready.
thank you so much. And we have for the next meetup, we have a short presentation of what the next meetup will be about.
Yes, hello everybody. I'm Lars, working for a company called Enfo. I'm going to be the host for next meeting, and the date will be 13th of June, so make a note of that. And I'm going to have a speak about serverless. It's going to be a demo about Apache OpenWhisk. And if any of you would like to be a speaker, just approach me after the meeting and we can talk about it. Because it would be great if you could have like a theme around serverless. So maybe someone can talk about Knative. That would be great. Okay.
You mean serverless peer-to-peer networks, for example?
Sorry?
Serverless peer-to-peer networks, for example?
No, serverless as function as a service. You know, AWS Lambda, everybody knows about.
Yeah.
Yeah. But this is open source cloud native. Okay? Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you.
So thank you all for listening. Please hang around and drink more beer and eat more pizza if we have any left.
There's some pizza left.
There's some pizza left, so please hang around. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone on the stream. See you.